Welcome! Reading Goodnight Stories with Bored Grandma. Hello everyone, it's Grandma here. Are you ready for bed? Do you have your teeth brushed? If so, here we go. Tonight I'm going to read My Big Book of Fairy Tales by Peter Stevenson. Retold by Louisa Somerville. Thumbelina. Once there was a woman who desperately wanted to have a child. As time passed and she still had no child, she went to visit a witch and asked her for help. To her surprise, the witch gave her a grain of barley. "Take this grain and plant it in a flower pot. Then wait to see what happens," said the witch. "Don't forget to water it well and be patient." The woman ran home and planted the barley right away. Every day, the woman watered the grain of barley. Weeks went by and nothing happened. One afternoon, to the woman's astonishment, a beautiful flower sprang up out of the pot. In the middle of the flower sat the tiniest girl the woman had ever seen. She was no larger than her thumb. "She's so tiny. I'll call her Thumbelina," said the woman. She was delighted to have a child at last and took great care of her. Thumbelina was a cheerful and contented child. Thumbelina was so tiny that she drank from an acorn cup, and at night she slept in a walnut shell for a bed. One night, as Thumbelina lay asleep on the window edge, an old toad hopped by. Looking through the window, she saw Thumbelina. "Oh, she'll make a nice wife for my son," thought the toad. So she picked Thumbelina up and took her home. The toad carried Thumbelina down to the stream where she lived. Then she placed Thumbelina on a lily pad far out in the middle of the stream. "She can't escape from here," she said to her son. When Thumbelina woke up and saw where she was, she began to cry. The fish in the stream felt sorry for her and cut through the lily stalk. Thumbelina started to float down the stream. The toad and her son chased after the lily pad. "Come back," called the son. "You're to be my bride today, Thumbelina." But just as the toads reached the lily, a beetle swooped down and snatched Thumbelina away. Thumbelina wondered whatever was to become of her. On and on they traveled, but then the beetle's legs grew tired and eventually he lost his grip on her. Luckily, she landed in the soft leaves of a tree in the forest. There she lived alone all summer. She was happy in the woods, feeding off nuts and berries. At last the days grew cooler. Winter was setting in, and Thumbelina started to feel bitterly cold. I must find a shelter, she thought to herself. Thumbelina set off through the forest to look for a place to shelter for the winter. After walking for several hours, she reached a cornfield where she stopped to rest. You look cold and tired, said a squeaky voice. Thumbelina turned around to see an old mouse. Come home with me and have something to eat, he said. Oh, thank you, cried Thumbelina. The mouse led her down into his cozy home underground. He sat her down before the fire and fed her tea and cakes. You can stay here all winter, said the mouse, if you're clean and cook for me. Thumbelina was happy to stay in the mouse's house. He was quite lonely and glad of the company. So they chatted away merrily all day long. Then one day, the mouse introduced Thumbelina to his neighbor, the mole. He was smartly dressed in the finest clothes. He is a very clever and will make you a fine husband, said the mouse. Soon enough, the mole asked Thumbelina to marry him. She agreed because the mole was a friend of the mouse who had been so kind to her. But Thumbelina didn't want to marry the mole. It made her very unhappy to think that she would have to say goodbye to the sun and live underground forevermore. As soon as Thumbelina agreed to marry the mole, he began to dig a tunnel from his home to the mouse's. The next day, the mole invited Thumbelina to his house. Walking through the tunnel, she stumbled across a bird laying across her path. It was a swallow, and it was laying very still. Don't worry about that dead old bird, cried the mole grandly, pushing past it. Later, when she made her way home, Thumbelina stopped beside the bird. Poor thing, she cried. You must have died of cold. Thumbelina ran to fetch a blanket and spread it over the bird. Then she lay down beside the bird and leaned her head against his feathery breast. To her amazement, she heard a faint thump, thump. The swallow's tiny heart was beating. The bird lifted its head and smiled at Thumbelina. I was numb with cold and dying, he said, but you have warmed me and brought me back to life. Thank you. Every day, Thumbelina took good care of the swallow. She fed and nursed him back to full health. When spring came and the sun's warmth could be felt underground, the swallow was strong enough to fly home. Will you come to see me? He asked. Thumbelina longed to say yes, but instead she shook her head. I can't. I've promised to marry the mole, she cried. Goodbye then, kind Thumbelina, said the swallow, and flew up into the sunshine and away. All through the summer, Thumbelina and the mouse were kept busy making preparations for her marriage to the mole. Every day that the mole came to visit her, she liked him less and grew more unhappy. The day of the wedding arrived, and Thumbelina went into the cornfield to look at the sun one last time before living underground forever. "Goodbye, beautiful sun," she called and started to cry. At that moment she heard a noise. Tweet, tweet! Looking up into the sky, Thumbelina saw her friend, the swallow. "Why are you crying?" asked the bird. "Because I'm going to marry the mole this very day, and then I'll have to live underground for the rest of my life and never see the sun again," sobbed Thumbelina. "Please don't cry," said the swallow gently. "It's time for me to fly south again, and this time I hope very much that you will agree to come with me." After a moment's hesitation, Thumbelina climbed onto the swallow's back. Off they flew towards the sun. They flew over fields and woods, over forests, and then out across the ocean. Thumbelina felt a warm breeze on her cheek as at last the swallow landed in a garden of flowers next to a palace. "This is my home," said the swallow. "You can live here too. Choose any flower to live in." Thumbelina climbed down onto an orchid. To her surprise, in the middle of it sat a tiny boy with wings, wearing a golden crown. "Welcome," he said. "I am the Flower King." Thumbelina was utterly astonished, for the Flower King was exactly the same size as she was. Then she looked around and saw that all the flowers had tiny people in them too. It was love at first sight for Thumbelina and the Flower King. When he asked her to marry him, she readily agreed, and they were married the very next day. After the ceremony, the Flower King gave Thumbelina a tiny pair of wings so that she could fly with him from flower to flower forever and ever. And as for the mole, at first he was inconsolable with grief. "My beautiful bride has gone," he wept dolefully. The mouse tried to cheer him up with tea and cakes. "You would have never been happy together," said the mouse. "You need the comfort of your cozy underground home, and Thumbelina needs the sun." At last the mole cheered up. "You're right, my friend," he admitted. "I really do prefer my own company." The end. Now off to dreamland you go.